let's help one author escape the lockdown. One author best known for a swarm of extraordinary characters and sometimes convoluted plots. But through his work, there runs a magnificent anger, a violent rage at the absurdities, the injustices, greed, and indifference of his times. In his postface to Our Mutual Friend in 1864, our author, Charles Dickens, remarked, "There is sometimes an odd disposition in this country to dispute as improbable in fiction what are the commonest experiences in fact." Well, we could add that there is at present a widely held belief that many of our commonest experiences are deemed so improbable that they are described as belonging in the realm of fiction, Dickensian fiction. We are told by the learned, the experienced, the wise and educated people who govern us that we are amongst the richest and happiest places on earth. And yet, common sense and the senses of the common people tell us something quite different. There is, it seems to me, much denial, ignorance, and indifference to evidence which is there to see for everyone who opens their eyes. Maybe, as the coronavirus exposes every day more cracks, more fault lines, more injustices, more greed, more indifference, we might open our eyes. Who knows? The following is one of our author's best known set pieces, written in 1838. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose and assisted by one or two women, ladled the gruel at mealtimes, of which composition each boy had one porringer and no more, except on festive occasions, and then he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. The bowls never wanted washing. The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again. And when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoon being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as if they could have devoured the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously with the view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel that might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally very excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cookshop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next to him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held, lots were cast, who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more, and it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and winked at Oliver while his next neighbours nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralysed with wonder, the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with a ladle, pinioned him in his arms, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. The board was sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement and, addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limpkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more," said Mr. Limpkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." Well, we are now in 2018 in a South London school canteen. This is Mandy. She is talking about the lady at the canteen checkout. So when she was like, "You can't get that, you're free school meals," I was really embarrassed because people were queuing behind me. I was kind of like, oh my God. And I was like, "But I've technically got £2 on my account." She was like, "No, you can't get that at free school meals." And it's like, you're really restricted to what you can eat with free school meals. And it's like, if you're saying £2 is on my balance, surely I should be able to get something that's worth less than £2. So that really got me. So now I just get what I know I'm safe with. So a small baguette and a carton of juice. An isolated case, surely. And this is Murad, also living in South London. The baguettes, you can tell in size which one's which. But like the sandwich boxes, the triangle sandwich boxes, one's black and one's brown, and I'm allowed the brown one, not the black one. But the thing about the baguettes is that if you're not free school meals, then you get to have bigger food, which I don't see why. And also they have cheesecakes. But there's like the smaller version and there's the bigger version. And if you're not free school meals, you get to have the bigger version. And if you are, you have to have the small version. By what pernicious calculation is the means-tested recipient of a school meal to get a smaller or inferior portion? By the same calculation as Mr. Bumble's when he suggested adding water to the boy's gruel to improve the accounts. And what of the little boy of 8 stealing tomato sauce sachets at school to make himself soup at home in 2018? Or others rifling through their school's dustbin? An isolated case, surely. Look around you. Where is this poverty? I see no poverty. Look at the facts. The facts tell you. A strong economy, fact. 700,000 families lifted out of poverty since 2010, fact. The lowest level of unemployment since the 70s. The fact is that 14 million people live in poverty. 1.5 million hovered in and out of destitution in 2018. The fact is that there were 350,000 rough sleepers in 2018, and 1.1 million households are on a social housing waiting list. The fact is that during 2018 and 2019, 3 million food parcels were distributed by food banks. And the fact is that now food parcel distribution has gone up between 50 and 300%. And the fact is that 1.3 million people were unemployed in 2019. And the final fact is that of those employed, many work only a few hours. But facts, facts, facts. In this life we want nothing but facts, said Mr. Bounderby of Coketown in Hard Times, 1854. Coketown, to which Messrs. Bounderby and Gradgrind now walked, was a triumph of fact. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows, where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets, still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound, upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. These attributes of Coketown were in the main inseparable from the work by which it was sustained. You saw nothing in Coketown but what was severely workful. If the members of a religious persuasion built a chapel there, as the members of 18 religious persuasions had done, they made it a pious warehouse of red brick, with sometimes, but this is only in highly ornamented examples, a bell in a birdcage on the top of it. All the public inscriptions in the town were painted alike, in severe characters of black and white. The jail might have been the infirmary. The infirmary might have been the jail. The town hall might have been either, or both, or anything else, for anything that appeared to the contrary in the graces of their construction. Fact, 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 everywhere in the material aspect of the town. Fact, 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 everywhere in the immaterial. The Machokum Child's School was all fact, and the School of Design was all fact, and the relations between master and man were all fact, and everything was fact between the lying-in hospital and the cemetery. And what you couldn't state in figures or show to be purchasable in the cheapest market and saleable in the dearest was not, and never should be, world without end. Amen.
Just so, my friend, you can't escape it. The market is a fact, and facts make the market, and the market is the coming together of facts. And the fact is that the market is the road to freedom, my friend. The road to self-improvement, enterprise, success, initiative, innovation, regeneration, renewal. It's the powerhouse of the north, the east, the west. Space is next.
A town like Coketown, so sacred to fact, and so triumphant in its assertion, of course got on well. Why, no. Not quite well. No? Dear me. No. Coketown did not come out of its own furnaces in all respects like gold that had stood the fire. First, the perplexing mystery of the place was who belonged to the 18 denominations, because whoever did, the labouring people did not. And your regeneration, and your innovation, and your renewal, and your powerhouses. The perplexing mystery still remains. Who actually benefits by them? It was very strange to walk through the streets of Coketown on a Sunday morning and note how few of the labouring people the barbarous jangling of bells called away from their own quarters. from their own close rooms, from the corners of their own streets, where they lounged listlessly, gazing at all the church and chapel going, as at a thing with which they had no manner of concern. Nor was it merely the stranger who noticed this, because there was a native organisation in Coketown itself, whose members were to be heard of in the House of Commons every session, indignantly petitioning for Acts of Parliament that should make these people religious by main force. Then came the Teetotal Society, who claimed that these same people would get drunk, and showed in statistical statements that they did get drunk, and proved at tea parties that no inducement, human or divine, would induce them to forego their custom of getting drunk.
These very same people will not work and idle away on benefits at the hard-pressed taxpayers' expense.
Then came the chemist and the druggist with other statistical statements showing that when they didn't get drunk, they took opium.
And of course, they smoke dope and they shoot heroin.
Then came the experienced chaplain of the jail, with more statistical statements, outdoing all the previous statistical statements, and showing that the same people would resort to low haunts, hidden from the public eye, where they heard low singing and saw low dancing, and may have joined in it.
And they miss school when they haven't already been expelled, and they join gangs, and they run county lines.
Then came Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby, the two gentlemen at this present moment walking through Coketown, both eminently practical, who could, on occasion, furnish more statistical statements derived from their own personal experience and illustrated by cases they had known and seen. That these same people were a bad lot altogether, gentlemen. That they were restless, gentlemen. That they never knew what they wanted. That they lived upon the best and bought fresh butter and insisted on mocha coffee and rejected all but prime parts of meat.
And they have iPads and 30-inch TVs. They don't pay their rent and they cheat the benefit system.
And yet, these people are eternally dissatisfied and unmanageable. Who are these people anyway? In the hardest working part of Coketown, in the innermost fortifications of that ugly citadel, where nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in, at the heart of the labyrinth of narrow courts upon courts and close streets upon streets, which had come into existence piecemeal, every piece in a violent hurry for some one man's purpose, and the whole an unnatural family, shouldering and trampling and pressing one another to death, lived the multitude of Coketown, generally called the Hands. Louisa knew of their existence, by hundreds and by thousands. She knew what results in work a given number of them would produce in a given space of time. She knew them in crowds, passing to and from their nests, like ants or beetles. But she knew from her reading infinitely more of the ways of toiling insects than of these toiling men and women. Something to be worked so much and paid so much and there ended. Something to be infallibly settled by laws of supply and demand. Something that blundered against those laws and floundered into difficulty. Something that was a little pinched when wheat was dear and overate itself when wheat was cheap. Something that increased at such a rate of percentage and yielded such another percentage of crime and such another percentage of pauperism. Something wholesale, of which vast fortunes were made. Something that occasionally rose like a sea and did some harm and waste, chiefly to itself, and fell again. This she knew the Coketown Hands to be. But she had scarcely thought once of separating them into units than of separating the sea itself into its component drops. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many 100-horse steam power. It is known to the force of a single pound weight what the engine will do But not all the calculators of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue into vice or the reverse at any single moment in the meanest of them forever. Suppose we were to reserve our arithmetic for material objects and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means.
We cannot govern without measurement, calculation and statistics.
Listen to Sissy Jupe in Hard Times. Now, Mr. McChoakumchild was explaining about national prosperity. He said, take a nation, and there are 50 million of money in it. Isn't this a prosperous nation and a thriving state? Girl number 20, aren't you in a thriving state? And I said I didn't know whether it was a prosperous nation and whether I was in a thriving state or not, unless I knew who had got the money and whether any of it was mine. But Mr. Choakumchild said that wasn't in the figures at all, and he would try me again. He said, take an immense town, and in it are 1 million inhabitants, and only 25 are starved to death in the street in the course of a year. What is your remark on that proportion? And my remark was, for I couldn't think of a better one, that I thought it might be just as hard upon those who were starved, whether the others were 1 million or 1 million.
No, this is insanely naive Dickensian sentimentality. Government is about weighty decisions, balancing a multiplicity of facts informed by statistics and data.
What, like unemployment figures are at their lowest since 1970?
Yes, at 3.8%.
And what is that 3.8% to the 1,300,000 that are unemployed? And what, repeated Mr. Bounderby, folding his arms, do you people, in a general way, complain of? Stephen Blackpool looked at him with some little irresolution for a moment, and then seemed to make up his mind. Sir, I were never good at showing of it, though I have had my share in feeling of it. Indeed, we are in a muddle, sir. Look round town, so rich as 'tis, and see the numbers of people as has been brought into being here, for to weave and to card and to piece out a living, all the same one way somehows, twixt their cradles and their graves. Look how we live, and where we live, and in what numbers, and by what chances, and with what sameness. And look how the mills is always a-going, and how they never works us no nigh to any distant object, except in always death. And look how you considers of us, and writes of us, and talks of us, and goes up with your deputations to Secretaries of State about us, and how you are always right, and how we are always wrong, and never had no reason in us since ever we were born. And look how this has grown and grown, sir, bigger and bigger, broader and broader, harder and harder from year to year, from generation to generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis not a muddle? Of course, said Mr. Bounderby. Now perhaps you'll let the gentleman here know how you would set this muddle, as you're so fond of calling it, to rights. I dunno, sir. I cannot be expecting to it. 'Tis not me as should be looking to for that, sir. 'Tis them as is put o'er me and o'er all the rest of us. What do they tack upon themselves, sir, if not to do it?
But now we are a prosperous country, the 5th richest country in the world.
Okay, well listen now to Jeff Winter, talking about his town of Rugeley, Yorkshire, in 2017. What is a decent job today? What have the mining companies become? If you went back 40 years, and I know you can't, you had a pit which employed a lot of skilled men. And a lot of people providing good machinery to that pit as well. There was mechanics and there was electricians. They were labouring jobs at the pit, but they were still good jobs. Good jobs. This was a happening place. The clubs were full every night. The pubs were full. And now, what are we becoming? The warehouse was empty for 2 years. Then Amazon came in. But are we grovelling then? Are we grovelling by saying, yes, we'll accept anything, like Amazon, because we are desperate for our people? You never saw that years ago. I know it's changed, and I can accept it's changed, but that doesn't make it right. And what does Amazon provide? 0-hour contracts? You don't want these jobs, so you go to university and take on £30,000 of debt, fueling capitalism. You buy the car on hire purchase, fueling capitalism. And you're living with your parents because you can't get a house. There's no social housing. Is that what we've accepted? It's a total what's it from what happened in this town 40 years ago. It's a totally different society. And kids obviously don't know because they've never been part of that. But it don't make it right. It don't make what we have become right. And what of Mr. Plornish? Of the Bleeding Heart Yard in Little Dorrit, 1857. They was all hard up here, Mr. Plornish said. Uncommon hard up, to be sure. Well, he couldn't say how it was. He didn't know as anybody could say how it was. All he knowed was that's so it was. What a man felt on his own back and in his own belly that poor he was, that man knowed well that he was poor somehow or another. And you couldn't talk it out of him no more than you could talk beef into him. Then, you see, some people, as was better off, said that they was improvident. That was the favourite word down the yard. For instance, if they see a man with his wife and children going to Hampton Court in a van, perhaps once in a year, they says, "Hello, I thought you was poor, my improvident friend." Why, Lord, how hard it was upon a man. What was a man to do? He couldn't go melancholy mad, and even if he did, you wouldn't be the better for it. In Mr. Plornish's judgment, you would be the worse for it. Yet, you seem to want to make a man melancholy mad. You was always at it, if not with your right hand, with your left. They was all hard up, and they was always squeezed. Mr. Panks, he was the rent collector that was squeezing them. The proprietor of the Bleeding Heart Yard was a patriarchal gentleman with an appearance of radiant benevolence. "Mr. Panks," said the patriarch, "you have been remiss, sir. You have been remiss." "What do you mean by that?" was the brief retort. "I mean, Mr. Panks, you must be sharper with the people. You don't squeeze them. Your receipts aren't up to the mark. You must squeeze them, sir, or the connection will not continue to be as satisfactory as I could wish it to be to all parties." "All parties? Don't I squeeze them?" retorted Mr. Panks. "What else am I made for?" "You are made for nothing else, Mr. Panks. You are made to do your duty, but you don't do your duty. You are paid to squeeze, and you must squeeze to pay." "Oh," said Mr. Panks. "Anything more?" Yes, sir, something more. You will please, Mr. Panks, squeeze the yard first thing on Monday morning. You are paid to squeeze and must squeeze to pay." There's a strange echo of this theme in Acton in 2018. The youth club hasn't quite had its funding cut, but it is being squeezed into a smaller space. And the young people who go there are squeezed into overcrowded housing. Their finances are squeezed through welfare cuts. Their will to do the right thing is squeezed by peer pressure to get rich by any means and escape.
No, we have the answers for that. Law and order. Punish the bad eggs, the preachers of hate, the rabble-rousers. And coffee shops to replace the youth centres.
I'll tell you something at any rate, said Mr. Bounderby. We will make an example of 6 rabble-rousers. We will indict the blackguards for felony and get them shipped off to penal settlements. Don't tell me we won't, man, said Mr. Bounderby, because we will, I tell you. Sir, returned Stephen, with a quiet confidence of absolute certainty. If you was to take 100 of them rabble-rousers and was to sew 'em up in separate sacks and sink 'em in the deepest ocean as were made, you'd leave the muddle just where it is. Rabble-rousers and mischievous strangers, said Stephen with an anxious smile. When have we not heard, I am sure, since ever we can call to mind, of the mischievous strangers? 'Tis not by them the trouble's made, sir. 'Tis not with them it commences. I've no favour for 'em. I've no reason to favour 'em, but it is hopeless and useless to dream, taking them from their trade instead of taking their trade from them. Put that clock aboard a ship and pack it off to Norfolk Island, and the time will go on just the same, so 'tis with the rabble-rousers every bit. Sir, I cannot, with my little learning and my common way, tell the gentleman what will be better all this. But I can tell him what I know will never do it. The strong hand will never do it. Victory and triumph will never do it. Agreeing for to make one side unnaturally always and forever right, and t'other side unnaturally always and forever wrong, will never, never do it. Nor yet letting alone will never do it. Most of all, rating them as so much power, and rating them as if they was figures in a sum, or machines. Statistics, without loves and likens. Without memories and inclinations, without souls to weary and souls to hope. When all goes quiet, dragging on with them as if they'd now to the kind, and when all goes unquiet, reproaching them for their want of such humanly feelings in their dealings with you. This will never do it, sir, till God's work is unmade.
It is very disappointing, to say the least, to see the extraordinary political turn this is all taking. I suppose you're going to quote that UN chappie next with his extraordinarily inappropriate language.
Indeed. Professor Alston says, it might seem to some observer that the Department of Work and Pensions has been tasked with designing a digital and sanitised version of the 19th century workhouse. British compassion has been replaced by a punitive, mean-spirited and often callous approach designed to impose a rigid order on the lives of those least capable of coping. The state has become an instrument of punishment instead of support, shoving the blame onto the victims. Squeeze them. In Our Mutual Friend from 1864, said Betty Higden, do I never read in the newspapers how the worn-out people that do come down to that get driven from post to pillar and pillar to post to purpose to tire them out? Do I never read how they are put off, how they are grudged the shelter or the doctor or the drop of physic or a bit of bread? Do I never read how they grow heart sick of it and give it up after having let themselves drop so low, and how they after all die out for want of help? Then I say, I hope I can die as well as another, and I'll die without that disgrace. Do we not read in the newspapers in 2017 of that wheelchair-bound woman who lost her support because she couldn't get into the building for her assessment, or the woman sanctioned for 229 days for missing her assessment appointment by having a miscarriage, or the men and women dying in the street for want of shelter or care. The shameful accounts we read every week, my lords and gentlemen, and honourable boards, the infamous records of small official inhumanity, do not pass by the people as they pass by us. And hence, these irrational, blind, and obstinate prejudices, so astonishing to our magnificence, and having no more reason in them than smoke has in coming from fire. God save the Queen, and confound their politics.
This is inflammatory, political. We strongly refute the claim that the design and delivery of welfare reforms is deliberately punishing. Tackling poverty will always be a priority for this government.
Ha! If I may, I will quote Mr. Podsnap here from Our Mutual Friend, 1864. Thus, happily acquainted with his own merit and importance, Mr. Podsnap settled that whatever he put behind him, he put out of existence. There was a dignified exclusiveness, not to add a grand convenience, in this way of getting rid of disagreeables, which had done much towards establishing Mr. Podsnap in his lofty place in Mr. Podsnap's satisfaction. I don't want to know about it. I don't choose to discuss it. I don't admit it. Mr. Podsnap had even acquired a peculiar flourish of his right arm in often clearing the world of its most difficult problems by sweeping them behind him and consequently sheer away with those words and a flushed face, for they affronted him. Are we too affronted? Do we not see, or do we simply not want to see, the houses built for one family let to 6 or 7? The decaying bed and breakfasts, squashed close to polluting roads, surrounded by neglected, rat-infested spaces. The damp, cold, mouldy rooms with decrepit fridges and collapsing ceilings, housing ever so many children. Do we not see the tents lined up by the vents at the back of office buildings, along the seafront of decaying resorts, or in every nook and cranny of railway stations? Verily, my lords and gentlemen and honourable boards, when we have got things to the pass that with the enormous treasure at disposal to relieve the poor, the best of the poor detest our mercies, hide their heads from us, and shame us by starving to death in the midst of us, it is a pass impossible of prosperity, impossible of continuance. This boastful handiwork of ours strikes with a cruel and a wicked stab. We must mend it, my lords and gentlemen and honourable boards, or in its own evil hour it will mar every one of us. In 1847, London suffered a cholera epidemic due to poor sewage, and which was predicted for a long time, not unlike the present pandemic. In Bleak House, written in 1852, there is a warning. Joe lives, that is to say, Joe has not yet died, in a ruinous place known to the like of him by the name Tom All Alone's. It is a black, dilapidated street avoided by all decent people, where the crazy houses were seized upon when their decay was far advanced by some bold vagrants who, after establishing their own possession, took to letting them out in lodgings. Now these tumbling tenements contain by night a swarm of misery. As on the ruined human wretch vermin parasites appear, So these ruined shelters have bred a crowd of foul existence that crawls in and out of gaps in walls and boards, and coils itself to sleep in maggot numbers where the rain drips in and comes and goes, fetching and carrying fever and sowing more evil in its every footprint than can be set right in 500 years. Much mighty speech-making there has been, both in and out of Parliament concerning Tom, and much wrathful disputation how Tom shall be got right, whether he shall be put into the main road by constables, or by beadles, or by bell-ringing, or by force of figures, or by correct principles of taste, or by high church, or by low church, or by no church, whether he should be set to splitting trusses of polemical straws with the crooked knife of his mind, or whether he should be put to stone-breaking instead. In the midst of which dust and noise, there is but one thing perfectly clear, to wit, that Tom only may and can, or shall and will, be reclaimed according to somebody's theory, but nobody's practice. And in the hopeful meantime, Tom goes to perdition, head foremost in his old, determined spirit. But he has his revenge. Even the winds are his messengers, and they serve him in these hours of darkness. There is not a drop of Tom's corrupted blood, but propagates infection and contagion somewhere. It shall pollute this very night the choice stream. There is not an atom of Tom's slime, not a cubic inch of any pestilential gas in which he lives, not one obscenity or degradation about him, not an ignorance, not a wickedness, not a brutality of his committing, but shall work its retribution through every order of society, up to the proudest of the proud and to the highest of the high. Verily, what with tainting, plundering, and spoiling, Tom has his revenge. In a letter at the time he was writing Little Dorrit, Dickens says, "I see an enormous black cloud of poverty in every town, which is spreading and deepening every hour." Utilitarian economists, skeletons of schoolmasters, commissioners of fact, genteel and used-up infidels, gabblers of many little dog-eared creeds. The poor you have with you. Take note of them while there is time yet. On the day of your triumph, when gentleness is utterly driven out of their souls, and they and a bare existence stand face to face, reality will take a wolfish turn and make an end of you. Is that what is to be? Creeds from ancient times and much more recent ones have it that all men are equal, that all men have rights, rights to shelter, warmth, food and knowledge. Is that what is to be? Let us cultivate the seeds that are in all men for understanding, compassion, sharing, gentleness and kindness. Dear public, it rests with you and me whether in our fields of action these things shall be or not. Let them be.